ASUS has claimed to have released the world's first gaming monitor to feature a glossy WOLED display. And if you've ever seen an LG C-Series OLED TV, you'll know they have glossy coatings which not only give excellent clarity and vibrancy, but unlike Quantum OLED, they do not light up magenta when hit with ambient light. But the question is this new glossy coating from ASUS as good as those LG TVs? Is it better than a matte coating? And is the monitor actually any good? Well, today we're going to find out just that, and to do so, let's take a very in-depth look at their brand new ASUS XG27AQDMG. Now, this monitor I did purchase myself, which thank you to all my Patreon supporters for making reviews like this possible, but this is a 27-inch 1440p 240Hz WOLED display with an alleged response time of 0.03 milliseconds. Yes, it does have G-Sync and FreeSync support, and it comes with the typical Display HDR 400 True Black certification. Now, in terms of the overall design, I think it's decent, and I do especially like the back of the monitor. However, the front for me, I think that ASUS chin does need to go, and I do believe I'm not alone in saying that. Now, in terms of the stand, it's actually excellent, has a very small footprint, and it can even hold a phone, and you can mount a camera on top of it as well. Plus, you do get VESA mount support, and that camera mounting ability is actually really cool, and I do want to see other manufacturers take note of that function. Now, in terms of the ports, pause if you need to. Yes, it does not come with HDMI 2.1, but at this resolution and refresh rate, you actually don't need it, so don't worry about it. Now, in terms of the price, it actually is coming in with a pretty aggressive starting price of $699.99. Now, eventually, I do think it'll go up to $749, but at its introductory price, that's actually around $100 lower than the AQDM that it's going to be replacing, and on paper, it should actually be even better. So that's actually a really great price, and with a 3-year plus burn-in warranty, it's all looking really good, and I would say I can't wait to recommend this, but first, we actually have to go ahead and take a look as to whether or not it's a good monitor. And to do so, let's start off with the color. Now, my first impressions are it's great in SDR, it has good accuracy and vibrancy, but in HDR, in some cases, it will fall behind QD OLED, as QD OLED does have higher brightness on colors. Now, in terms of the calibration, out of the box, it's a little bit off, although with some simple adjustments, I was able to get it into the correct color space, as well as have a good RGB balance and pretty decent overall EOTF curve tracking at Gamma 2.2. Now, in HDR, unfortunately, it's not quite as good. It gives me very limited ability to adjust it, and it is over brightening some shadows at the very bottom there. And by the way, I will have the best settings for this display in my Patreon linked in the description below. Now, in terms of the color volume, like I mentioned, here you can see in HDR, it's only getting 68% roughly DCI-P3. In SDR, it'll be around 100%, but yes, this is the downside of WOLED. It will get beat out in that color in HDR. Now, in terms of the brightness, I will say overall, this is a pretty decent improvement in full screen brightness, which is great for day-to-day usage, but in HDR, it is lacking some of the brightness that you might expect to see out of an OLED TV or a mini LED monitor, so don't expect to be wowed by super bright HDR scenes. Now, in terms of the window brightness, it's pretty decent overall, but unfortunately, even though it has a better full screen brightness, it is significantly lower on the 10% window than the PG27AQDM, which is the matte coating version we've had for some time. So overall, that monitor is actually slightly brighter when it comes to window brightness. However, it is significantly brighter than something like a Quantum OLED monitor, so do keep that in mind. But I do want to bring up the Doe Spectrum Black 27. Now, regardless of how you feel about Doe, they do have the ability to make some very bright OLEDs, and here is definitely one such case. I mean, this is technically using apparently the same panel, but it's actually significantly brighter than the ASUS model in window testing. And then, of course, mini LEDs are just on a completely different level. And then if we take a look at an actual game, here you can see that the trends do continue, but here the Spectrum Black even pulls further away in terms of that brightness. So I would like to see other OLEDs from ASUS, you know, match or even exceed something like the Spectrum Black in the future, but we'll just have to wait and see if they unlock that potential. Now, in terms of the near black performance, here it's actually very impressive. Both in SDR and HDR, you're getting basically all the shadow detail that you could want, which is great. And in terms of gaming, also 240Hz OLED is excellent. I mean, not only is it great for HDR because sure, it doesn't have that HDR punch, but it does have the per pixel local dimming and the infinite contrast ratio. But for gaming, you get those excellent response times and super low latency of just 24 milliseconds of total system latency, which puts it as one of the fastest displays that I have ever tested. And speaking of super fast response times, let's take a look at them. Here you can see at 240Hz, this is very, very impressive. It's not quite as good as 480Hz OLED as you can see on the right there, but overall, it's absolutely smashing something like a 144Hz mini LED, and that's because OLED is just super fast. But what makes this one really impressive is their black frame insertion feature. I mean, you can actually run this monitor at just 120Hz and get the same motion performance as 240Hz, which is really crazy to see. I mean, look at that 120Hz without BFI. It's way behind the motion of the BFI 120Hz. So that's actually a great reason to pick up a monitor like this. However, do keep in mind it will significantly reduce your brightness. So for me, I'd probably stay away from it, but for some people, that is a great feature. Now, in terms of other features, they do have a clear text option, which in some cases can get rid of some of the fringing, but unfortunately it will make text a little bit blurry. And then another huge feature that they've been touting is OLED anti-flicker. Now, this has been a big discussion about OLED flicker, so if they can solve that, that is going to be huge. And on paper, this setting is great. I mean, you can turn it on and all of a sudden your game gets certainly less flickery. However, it's maybe not quite as good as I was expecting because it seems like, at least to me, that maybe ASUS is going about solving VRR flicker by kind of disabling VRR when it's an issue. And what I mean is, if you actually have it off, and I checked in the EDID of the display through custom resolution utility, well, you get a VRR range of 40 to 240. However, on the medium preset, it bumps that to 160 to 240. And then on the strong preset, it bumps that up even further to 200 to 240. Now, what that means is your G-Sync or FreeSync ability won't be kicking in unless you're actually achieving 160 FPS or higher on the medium or 200 FPS or higher on the strong. And going from 200 to 240, that's only a 40Hz VRR range. And you also are going to probably have to cap it to 225 to not have tearing. So you effectively have a 25 FPS VRR range. Yeah, so it does come with its negatives. Now, they do also give you uniform brightness, which is great if you're into professional work and need that. However, I do prefer leaving that off for the much higher brightness. And then you do also get aspect control on the monitor as well. So there's a ton of features. They all have their benefits and their negatives, but it gives you a lot of different options. Now, next, let's talk about the text clarity and the subpixel layout. Now, the text clarity is good when you take a look at, say, a white background with black text, but it can definitely struggle against gray thanks to the bizarre GRWB subpixel layout. Now, I was hoping it would have the new subpixel layout, which is RGWB, but unfortunately it doesn't. So there will be some fringing on text or various different objects. But now, guys, the moment you have all been waiting for is here. It's time to talk about the finish and the perceived clarity. And this is going to be a complicated one because I'll just tell you straight up, the clarity is much better than their more expensive and older XG27AQDM, which has a full matte coating. And it certainly does handle ambient light much better when compared to Quantum.OLED, as you can see right now. However, when compared to, say, a LG C series OLED TV, well, it's just not as good. It does have some minor tinting, much like what you would see on a LG MLA equipped G series display, which of course makes sense because this is an MLA monitor, which stands for micro lens array, as they use those micro lenses to refocus the light and gain a ton of extra brightness, but it's not quite the same. And the reason why I say that is because the coatings are not only clearly different just by taking a look at a distance, but when you get close, it's actually not entirely grain-free on this ASUS glossy coating. In fact, I would say that maybe it's 50% grain-free when compared to the matte version. So yeah, that's a huge improvement. It's a lot more clear, but unfortunately you are still going to get some of that grain that we're trying to avoid by using a glossy panel. So that's a very, very bizarre choice, and I'm not entirely sure why that's happening, although that's something that certainly does need to be improved in the future. And what is a glossy coating, and what should we be looking for in a display coating overall? And to answer that question, I've gone ahead and put together actually an ideal coating checklist. So this is just what you would want to be looking for when looking for a coating in a display if you value clarity and vibrancy and the best overall picture. And as you can see just right away, this is a significant improvement over their previous matte OLED, but it's also significantly worse than something like the LG C4 OLED, which is just absolutely excellent. I mean, it does not have crisp reflections. They're a little bit blurry. It does have some grain. It does have a bit of that matte oily look to it, although of course not nearly as intense. And it's also not using a premium glass finish. So yeah, it does have the benefits of it's easy to clean. It does have a flat surface. The reflections are a little bit more crisp instead of blurred. And then it does have some light resistance, and it does give you more vibrant colors. So yeah, it's an improvement, but even when compared to something like the Spectrum Black from Doe, which is going to be, I think, its direct competitor, I do think that is actually a little bit less grainy, a little bit less oily looking, because remember, they are actually applying Gorilla Glass over a matte coating, and I think they're doing a pretty good job of it, but it does leave a little bit to be desired. And then even when compared to a 32-inch Quantum Dot OLED monitor, you know, in their marketing, they were calling that semi-gloss. I know some people do call it semi-gloss. I'm not entirely sure why. I don't know what about it makes it semi-gloss other than it has an anti-reflective treatment on it, but I wouldn't consider that making something semi-gloss. If it has crisp reflections, to me, that's glossy. To me, this monitor is actually closer to semi-gloss than something like QD OLED, because QD OLED does not have grain. It does not have any oil. It has its own problems. It is not resistant to light, and it's not easy to clean. However, it is in a light controlled room gonna give you a more clear picture. So that's gonna be something that's gonna be a decision you're gonna have to make. Do I want a more clear picture if I'm willing to control my lighting, or will the magenta or gray tinting of QD OLED be so distracting and harm the contrast so much that this monitor will be the superior coating for me? And that's a genuinely good question. That's something that only you can answer. Now, the viewing angles on this display are actually pretty good overall. It had no major uniformity issues. You might run into some slight vertical banding on grays, but typically a pixel clean will clean that up. And the menu and firmware itself was also really great. So overall, this is a big improvement over their previous matte version. I mean, it's better for bright rooms than QD OLED. It's clearer than a full matte coating. And of course, it is coming in at $699, which I do think is a really good price for this level of a display. However, it does have some pretty direct competition, in my opinion, with the Doe Spectrum Black 27, as it just got a $200 price cut to $899. So they're within $200 of each other. Now, ASUS is a more established and reputable brand, and they do also have better features and better firmware and accuracy, which is great to see. So overall, I'm gonna say, you know what? It's really going to depend on what you want, right? On what type of OLED you want. Do you want the clearest OLED on the market? Well, then you might have to go with something like an LG OLED TV or a Quantum Dot OLED monitor. Or do you want like one of the brightest OLEDs you can get right now? Well, Doe has that with the Gorilla Glass. However, I do think that this does have a good place in the market. I'd like to see them improve upon and eventually completely eliminate the grain under this coating. However, even in its current state, it's a big improvement, and I do think at $699 that with all the advantages that I just listed, that I think a lot of people will and should actually consider this over other alternatives. So there you have it. I do recommend it, but it does come with some caveats.